Thus began the Third Age of the world, after the eldest days and the black years. And there was still hope in that time and the memory of mirth, and for long the white tree of the Eldar flowered in the courts of the kings of men. For the seedling which he had saved Isildur planted in the citadel of Arnor in memory of his brother, ere he departed from Gondor. The servants of Sauron were routed and dispersed, yet they were not wholly destroyed. Hey everyone, Yoistin here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we will be continuing our Timeline of Arda series into the beginning of the Third Age, and the fading of Isildur and Anarian's lines, the lineages of the kings. For more information specifically on the histories of Gondor and Arnor during this period, or for my previous videos in this series, please check out the related articles and videos in the description and cards. My friends, thank you all so much for being here. Let us begin our tale as we journey back into Middle-earth. We will start today just like how we began the Second Age in this series, by looking at where the major factions were located at the beginning of the age and who ruled them. Since the Third Age is primarily dominated by men, we will start there. In the North Kingdom of Arnor, after the death of Isildur in the year 2, his descendants would continue to rule that realm, while the lineage of his brother Anarian would continue to rule in Gondor. Thus, the kings of Gondor and those of Arnor would be cousins going back through to these two brothers, the sons of Elendil. At this point, I would imagine many middlemen lived in the kingdom of Rhovanion, and others lived in the Númenórean kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, and other places besides. The Easterlings and men of the south dwelt in their realms as well. As for the elves, after the death of Gil-galad in the War of the Last Alliance, the centralization of power amongst the remaining Noldor in Middle-earth would be broken, and each realm would be ruled by its own lords, ladies, kings, and queens. Círdan the Shipwright ruled in Lindon. Elrond Half-Elven was the Lord of Rivendell. Galadriel and Celeborn at this time still wandered in Middle-earth, but would come to dwell in Lothlorien, which was the kingdom of King Amroth after the death of his father Amdir in the war, and Thranduil became the king of Mirkwood in the absence of his father Orifer, another victim of the war. As for the dwarves, they still dwelt under the rule of Durin's line and Khazad-dûm. As can be seen with this summary, the beginning of the Third Age was rather somber. The war, while it had seen to the temporary end of Sauron, also saw the end of many great kings, and many good soldiers as well. But there would still be joy in the world, for Elrond would wed Celebrian, the daughter of Galadriel and Celeborn, in 109 of the Third Age, and to them would soon after be born Elladan and Elrohir, as well as Arwen Undomiel. Now, like I mentioned before, the Third Age was truly the beginning of the dominion of men as the hegemonic people of the world. And while the story of the second-born children of Eru grew in this time, the story of the elves began to fade more. For while the Eldar had yet time left in the world, their time was beginning to wane. Throughout this age and the many wars of men, the elves would leave these shores, either from Lindon or Ethelond in South Gondor, but other elves remained to see a true end of Sauron. Others, like Galadriel, still wanted to rule their own realm before returning to Valinor, and there was also the matter of the Three Rings, for while the One Ring remained in the world, they too would yet have power. The Three Rings at this time were held by Círdan, Elrond, and Galadriel. The 9 Rings of men were with their keepers, the Nazgûl, in hiding, and the 7 Rings of the dwarves were with their respective lords, but would throughout the age be devoured by dragons or reclaimed by Sauron. Now let's take a look at the first 2,000 years or so of the Third Age, and the important world and kingdom-shaping events that happened therein. Gondor and Arnor would continue to flourish and grow, coming eventually into their own separate golden ages. In Gondor, Minas Ithil would be rebuilt in 420 after having once been taken by Sauron in the Great War. Eventually, the Easterlings would invade 70 years later, and this would be the start of many conflicts throughout the age between the men of the West and East, although these Easterlings would be defeated 10 years later by the might of Gondor. As for the realm of the North, Arnor would eventually fracture in 861 of the Third Age, becoming 3 petty kingdoms, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur. This kingdom, and its 3 petty kingdoms, saw a population decrease after the Great War, and the later squabbles between these petty kingdoms with the influence of Angmar would see an even greater population decrease. The capital of Arnor would move from Annúminas to Fornost, when Annúminas became too depopulated. Looking south once more, Gondor and the men of the south would have conflict, as Gondor would take Umbar, only for it to be besieged, and for a war between Gondor and Harad to break out, ending with Gondor conquering Harad and reaching the height of its power in 1050, for it held settlements in the south and east. Now turning our attention to matters of the great and wise, after a council of the Valar in Valinor, The lords and ladies of the West decided to send 5 wizards to Middle-earth to help combat the shadow of Sauron that was yet upon it. Thus, the wizards came to Middle-earth around the year 1000, if not some came before, and Círdan gave his ring Narya, the Ring of Fire, to Gandalf to aid him in his future endeavors. Gandalf would travel the lands of the north and west, and the wise eventually discovered an evil power, thought to be one of the Nazgul at the stronghold of Dol Guldur, which had forced the elves of Thranduil further northward in Mirkwood. Saruman and the Blue Wizards would go into the east for centuries at this time in the age. But where there is darkness, there is yet also light, as there always is. This is our 13th episode of the Timeline of Arda, and throughout all of this tale so far, an important people, yet small in stature and considerations amongst the wise, have not yet entered into the greater story of Middle-earth. Not until now, that is. In 1050, the first group of a people later known as hobbits, the Harfoots, entered Eriador, coming over the mountains from Rhovanion. Around the year 1150 of the Third Age, the Followhides, another group, entered Eriador as well, even as another group of the hobbits, the Stoors, came over the Redhorn Pass of the Misty Mountains and moved to the Angle, or Dunland, in southern Eriador. And going back to men, though they warred, they did not forget their roots, the kings of old, and in 1248, King Menelkar built the Pillars of the Argonath, the statues of Anarion and Isildur that began the Southern Kingdom, whose legacies literally and figuratively loomed over the realm of Gondor. Around 1300, the hobbits migrated further westward, with some even coming to Bree. At this same time, however, evil began to multiply once more, for orcs increased in the Misty Mountains, waylaying the dwarves. The Nazgul, the 9 ring-wraiths, appeared once more in Middle-earth, and the Lord of the Nine went to Angmar to found his kingdom that he would use to crush the petty kingdoms of Arnor, which were already killing each other's kings and driving the Stoors out of the Angle. In 1409, the Witch King began his invasion of the north, with help from Rhudaur, which had already fallen to him. In the Southern Kingdom, Gondor would face a civil war known as the Kin-strife, as the blood of the men of Rhovanion entered into the bloodline of kings. Osgiliath would be burned, a Palantir lost, and eventually the war would end with a great battle in southern Gondor and a siege at Pelargir. Umbar would be taken by the escaping rebels against Gondor, which would eventually result in further conflicts with Harad and Umbar for Gondor. In 1601, the hobbits would move into the Shire, granted to them by the King of Arthedain of the time, and in the coming years, some Stoors from Dunland would arrive as well, meaning that all 3 groups lived there. The Corsairs of Umbar, or so they were called, would ravage Pelargir in 1634 and slay the King of Gondor at that time. And a year later, the Great Plague began, which would devastate the populations of the men of Rhovanion, Gondor, and Cardolan primarily, and the hobbits would be affected by this as well. This would end Osgiliath's tenure as the capital of Gondor, for the capital would thus be moved to Minas Anor, even after the death of the White Tree, which would soon be replanted. Mordor would be left unguarded, even as the shadow still dwelt on Dol Guldur, biding its time. Soon after the eventual defeat of the Corsairs, Gondor would be attacked by the Wainriders of the Easterlings, ending Gondor's reign over its eastern territories, and the Wainriders would devastate the Gondorian line of kings, until the Wainriders' eventual defeat in 1944. Indeed, dark times were upon the kingdoms of men, which is why they renewed communications and formed an alliance in 1940, as Arnor and Gondor both needed each other, and the King Arvedui of Arnor would marry Firiel, a daughter of the King of Gondor, for even with the aid of Rhovanion, Gondor was in dire need, as was Arnor, for Cardolan had since fallen, and Arthedain was the only petty kingdom left. But this alliance would not save the North Kingdom, for the Witch King would overrun Arnor and take Fornost, the capital of Arthedain, in 1974, and the next year, the last king, Arvedui, would perish in the Ice Bay of Forukel, losing 2 more Palantiri. His son Aranarth would be the first chieftain of the Dunedain, and the heirlooms of the kings would be given to the keeping of Elrond and Rivendell, for the remaining men of Arnor would be rangers in the wild, exiles of their kingdom of old. However, the elves could not sit idly by while Angmar took the north, and so the elves of the north, as well as the men of Gondor, went north to defeat the Witch King in the Battle of Fornost. This battle would reveal the truth of who the Witch King was, a Nazgul of Sauron, and this would begin a rivalry between the Witch King and Prince Eärnur of Gondor. In 1977, the Eotheid of the Kingdom of Rhovanion moved into the northern vales of Anduin, while other men would at some point form the Kingdom of Dale next to a solitary, lonely mountain, a mining colony of the dwarves. The hobbits would soon choose a Thane to take the place of the King of Arnor that was no more. In 1980, the Witch King, in his exile from the north, would come to Mordor and gather the Nazgul. And that same year, the dwarves would be hit with the greatest catastrophe that the Longbeards had yet seen, for a Balrog named Durin's Bane would awaken in Khazad-dûm and slay Durin VI, exiling the dwarves from their home. The following year would see many dwarves flee Khazad-dûm, now named Moria, and many Sylvan elves of Lorien, along with Nimrodel and King Amroth, would flee Lothlorien, and Galadriel and Celeborn would become the lord and lady thereafter of that land. In 1999, the kingdom under the mountain would be established for the dwarves. Yet evil moved still in all places, for the Nazgul would soon besiege Minas Ithil and take it for their own, capturing the Palantir of the city of Isildur. After the fall of the city, it would become known as Minas Morgul, and Minas Anor, the city of Anarion, would stand in opposition to Minas Morgul, thus being named Minas Tirith. The Witch King would challenge his old rival Arnor of Gondor to a duel multiple times, only for the brash king who had no heirs to accept in 2050. The last king of Gondor rode off to duel the Witch King at Minas Morgul, and he was never seen again. Indeed, it is with the end of the King of Gondor that this episode concerning the beginning of the Third Age and the fading of the kings comes to its end. However, the hope of men lingered still, for the blood of Isildur and Anarion both remained hidden in the chieftains of the Dunedain of the north, like a white tree of hope waiting to bloom. From this tale of the early Third Age, we see that even though the great heroes of legend must pass, we should not say that no other greats can rise anew. Indeed, it is in such times when they are needed the most. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this episode of the Timeline of Arda. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections on this part of the timeline? Let me know in the comments below. It occurred to me while making this just how much strife befell the West in the early part of the Third Age, but such events really set the stage for the great heroes to arise at the end of the age. Thanks to our Valar tier patrons, Adrian De la Torre, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Jonathan Putnam, Mark Kralik, Blair Scout, and Tobias Goldner, Merton, John Hume, Reggie93, Jennifer Wood, Sam McBee, Matt Sabach, Quantum Catalyst, Elizabeth Calvert, Maz Gibbs, Ben Gardner, Kondar, and Kyle Wetzel. Thank you so much, and thank you to all of our patrons. It really means a lot. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I'll see you all again next week with an epic character history on Saruman the White and of many colors. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.